In the final hours of the 23rd of October 2077, the world stood at the brink of extinction, without yet realizing that the brink had already been crossed. The machinery of annihilation set irreversibly in motion by decades of policy, paranoia, and technological hubris that no single government could stop. Historians of the post-war era, those who pieced together fragments of data from rusted terminals and degraded holotapes, agree that the morning began like so many others in the waning years of the resource wars. An atmosphere of uneasy routine layered over the quiet terror of a civilization stretched beyond its capacity to sustain itself. Across the continental United States, fusion-powered commuter vehicles hummed along cracked highways, while radio hosts filled the airwaves with news of energy shortages and distant military skirmishes. In the capital, the White House's underground Situation Room was manned by defense personnel monitoring satellite telemetry from orbiting platforms designed to detect missile launches, each blip on the radar a potential herald of apocalypse. The Chinese leadership, enclosed in its own hardened facilities somewhere beneath the mountains of Shanxi, maintained a similar vigil, convinced that American military doctrine now favored preemptive strikes under the guise of continental defense. Civilian life, though outwardly stable, had long since adapted to emergency procedures. Air raid drills were commonplace. Vault-Tec advertisements promising safety beneath the earth played endlessly on television, their optimistic jingles masking the grim arithmetic that only a fraction of the population could ever be saved. In Boston, research teams at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, soon to be known only as the Institute, continued their secretive experiments in robotics and synthetic biology, while on the opposite coast, the remnants of the once proud Silicon Valley economy had been absorbed entirely into defense contracting. America's economy, its culture, and its scientific ambition were now single threads in a fabric woven for total war. Few among the citizenry still believed peace with China was possible, yet most assumed deterrence would hold, as it had for generations, a stalemate maintained by fear itself. The truth, reconstructed from declassified enclave archives, and corroborated by intercepted Chinese communications, reveals that by dawn on that Saturday morning, Terrence had already failed in practice, even if no side had consciously acknowledged it. Automated targeting systems, newly integrated with strategic decision-making algorithms, were configured for rapid response to minimize human hesitation. At 9:13 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, scattered reports of sensor anomalies began arriving at NORAD Command in Colorado. Operators initially dismissed them as atmospheric interference. The early warning network had experienced similar false positives during the previous week's solar flare activity. Yet redundancy protocols required that every anomaly be logged and cross-checked, so satellite arrays adjusted their focus toward the Pacific Rim. Simultaneously, an undersea monitoring station off the coast of Alaska detected acoustic signatures consistent with the launch of submarine-based missiles. Whether those signatures originated from Chinese boomers patrolling the Arctic shelf or from a misread geological tremor remains the question that has haunted every historian since. At 9:17 a.m., the first set of civilian communications disruptions occurred. Power fluctuations rippled through the Western grid, the side effect of emergency rerouting to military facilities that had switched to combat readiness. In Anchorage, where reconstruction after the liberation from Chinese occupation had been ongoing for years, the garrison received a coded red alert to prepare for potential retaliatory operations. Eyewitness diaries recovered from the Anchorage Memorial Museum describe soldiers mustering in disbelief, convinced that yet another drill was underway. Across the Pacific, Chinese intelligence analysts were observing the same irregular patterns through their own surveillance channel. Their system, built upon American code stolen decades earlier, interpreted the heightened power output from U.S. missile fields as evidence of imminent launch preparations. The chain reaction of misinterpretation was instantaneous. At 9:23 a.m., the Chinese Central Military Commission entered Level 1 readiness. Nuclear silos along the mainland's northern perimeter opened blast doors for the first time since their installation. In Washington, the president, whose identity the enclave later sought to preserve as the last legitimate commander-in-chief, was evacuated to an undisclosed bunker. The public, unaware of these maneuvers, continued their routines. News networks reported vague references to technical disturbances in communication satellites, while government spokesmen urged calm. Beneath the calm veneer, encrypted exchanges between defense secretaries and corporate contractors such as Poseidon Energy and Robco Industries revealed panic over automated counterstrike systems that might no longer respond to manual override. The Safeguard Defense Network, designed to protect the continental United States through autonomous control of anti-ballistic platforms, was operating on a closed loop due to an ongoing software update. It could detect threats, but not receive human cancellation commands without delay. A design flaw noted in congressional oversight hearings that never reached completion before the world ended. At 9:31 a.m., a misinterpreted radar echo over the Pacific was logged as a confirmed inbound trajectory. NORAD issued a preliminary DEFCON 1 alert to all regional commands. Within 2 minutes, Chinese satellites detected the corresponding activation and assumed the Americans had initiated launch procedures. The reciprocal launch authorization traveled through Chinese command channels so rapidly that by the time Washington attempted to verify the false alarm, at least one intercontinental missile had already left its silo near Lanzhou. The records end there in official Chinese archives, which were vaporized within the hour. American ground crews at Vandenberg Air Force Base saw the detection blip appear on their own radar and believed it signaled an incoming strike, not an outbound one. The counterstrike order that followed was issued through both human and machine confirmation, each validating the other in a deadly loop of logic that would define the apocalypse to come. At 9:42 a.m., the first American MIRV platforms began ascent, each carrying multiple warheads programmed for strategic urban centers. In the moments that followed, global satellite communication disintegrated into static. Civilian broadcasters across the country interrupted programming with emergency tones that soon ceased altogether. Survivors later recounted a brief, unnatural stillness preceding the first flash. From Boston to Los Angeles, the horizon bloomed with light brighter than the sun, rising from beyond the curvature of the Earth as atmospheric shock waves arrived seconds later. The Great War had begun, though the phrase war scarcely applies to what transpired in those 2 cataclysmic hours. The exchange was so rapid that no organized defense could function. Automated systems unleashed retaliatory salvos before confirmation of impact. Washington, New York, Beijing, and Shanghai disappeared almost simultaneously. Submarine crews in both navies launched their payloads under orders that were no longer being transmitted by living superiors. In orbit, observation satellites recorded the silent unfolding of humanity's extinction before their circuits fried from electromagnetic pulse. For decades afterward, scavengers would unearth fragments of those recordings, burnt-out drives carrying ghost images of continents consumed by fire. Yet the question of who launched first remains obscured by the very technologies meant to clarify it. According to logs found in the remains of Raven Rock, the president's bunker later commandeered by the Enclave, the earliest confirmed detonation on American soil occurred at 9:47 a.m. in the vicinity of Pennsylvania, possibly Pittsburgh. If true, that would indicate a Chinese first strike. However, Chinese survivors encountered in later centuries spoke of American missiles striking their coastal defenses minutes earlier, implying the opposite. Fallout 3's preserved terminals at the Pentagon's ruins, later redesignated the Citadel, contain partial copies of pre-war intelligence, suggesting that a rogue automated platform, possibly part of the strategic AI defense network, misinterpreted the radar reflection of a civilian launch test as hostile activity. Fallout 76's Appalachian records add another dimension, noting that Chinese submarine Yangtze 031 had been detected near the American East Coast mere days before the war, its captain receiving contradictory orders about retaliation protocols. Whether that vessel launched a preemptive missile or perished awaiting confirmation cannot be determined, but its existence supports theories of simultaneous panic rather than deliberate aggression. On that final morning, ordinary citizens experienced the end not as a moment of understanding, but as a collapse of everything familiar. School children in the D.C. suburbs saw the first mushroom cloud rising beyond the Potomac and mistook it for a thunderstorm. In San Francisco, where civil defense sirens failed due to power grid overload, witnesses later recalled a light so intense it cast shadows into concrete. In the Mojave region, the blast patterns preserved by geologic vitrification show that the western deserts absorbed multiple ground detonations, yet Las Vegas itself was spared direct impact, an anomaly often attributed to Robert House's orbital defense network, which he had secretly activated hours before global communications failed. His later statements confirm that he intercepted a portion of incoming warheads aimed at Nevada, though not enough to alter the planet's fate. Elsewhere, Vault-Tec's automated closure orders triggered simultaneously at 9:55 a.m. Within minutes, doors sealed across the country, consigning the chosen to decades of isolation. The majority never reached shelter. By 10:23 a.m., major population centers were obliterated, and atmospheric ignition patterns indicated secondary explosions from compromised reactors and weapons stockpiles. 2 hours later, silence settled over the hemisphere, broken only by the distant rumble of collapsing infrastructure and the steady fall of radioactive ash. The world had ceased to function as a system of nations and had become, instead, a scattered archipelago of survivors. The Great War lasted little more than a morning, yet it erased millennia of progress. From a historian's vantage, centuries later, the tragedy of that day lies not merely in its destruction, but in its perfect ambiguity. Every surviving record, American, Chinese, or corporate, was filtered through failing machines and terrified humans interpreting incomplete data. Even the Enclave, custodians of the most comprehensive pre-war archives, could not agree on the sequence of launches. Some internal memoranda speculate that an automated anti-submarine platform off the Pacific coast, responding to a corrupted data feed, executed a retaliatory algorithm without authorization. Others argue that Chinese command, fearing imminent loss of second strike capability, initiated launch upon detecting false positives from radar clutter. Both scenarios align with what little evidence remains, and both confirm the same outcome: a system too complex for human control destroyed the humans it was built to protect. Thus, the final morning of the 23rd of October 2077 stands as the most studied, yet least understood event in human history. It was the instant when deterrence collapsed into automation, when communication became noise, and when every ideology, capitalist, communist, nationalist, proved indistinguishable beneath the blinding white light of mutual annihilation. The historian looking back sees not a single villain or victim, but a civilization devoured by its own momentum. The evidence gathered from scorched databanks and oral traditions converges on a single conclusion. No one truly dropped the first bomb because, by that hour, the bombs had already dropped themselves. In the century leading up to the Great War, humanity's brightest age unfolded under the shadow of its own inventions, a paradox of progress where prosperity masked decline and innovation hastened extinction. The early 21st century had begun with the promise of limitless energy, driven by atomic research and the commercialization of fusion technology. Yet by the 2050 seconds that optimism had curdled into desperation, the fossil reserves that had sustained industrial civilization for 3 centuries were nearly exhausted, and synthetic substitutes proved insufficient for the global appetite of expansion. In the United States, the government's partnership with private industry created a new economic order, a corporate military symbiosis that defined every aspect of daily life. The smiling icons of Robco Industries, Voltec Corporation, and General Atomics International became as familiar as the stars on the flag, their slogans promising a future that no longer existed. To the public, the atomic age was still a golden dream. Nuclear-powered cars on the highway, Mr. Handy robots cleaning suburban homes, and gleaming skyscrapers powered by microfusion cores. To historians, however, these images now read as propaganda, symbols of a nation desperately maintaining the illusion of stability while its geopolitical and ecological foundations collapsed. The U.S. had long since shifted to a wartime economy even in times of peace, the line between civilian and military industry erased. Robco's terminals, marketed as consumer conveniences, were also designed for encrypted communication and surveillance. Poseidon Energy, the giant behind fusion research, doubled as a weapons contractor, developing portable reactors for battlefield use. Even Nuka-Cola, the world's most beloved beverage, had begun producing rations for soldiers under government contract. Meanwhile, America's cultural psyche turned inward, convinced that its technological superiority and moral authority could outlast the world's resource scarcity. The resulting nationalism was subtle at first. Patriotic advertising, slogans about freedom and innovation, but beneath it simmered the conviction that America's destiny was to endure at any cost. By the 2050 seconds, when global petroleum reserves fell to record lows, the U.S. secured control over the last major oil fields in Alaska, constructing a defensive line around the Anchorage region that became both a symbol of resilience and a provocation to rivals. China, itself, suffering catastrophic shortages, viewed this as an existential threat. The Sino-American tensions that would later ignite the resource wars were rooted not in ideology, but in survival. Both nations faced extinction without the other's resources. The European Commonwealth, once a unified bloc, fractured into regional wars over the Middle East, reducing that ancient cradle of civilization to irradiated wasteland decades before the Great War officially began. Fallout's scattered references to the oil wars of the 2050 seconds described the first of many chain reactions, conflicts that depleted humanity's ability to rebuild even before the bombs fell. The United States emerged from that era bloodied but triumphant, and its leaders mistook survival for victory. Government archives later recovered by the Brotherhood of Steel reveal a series of classified memoranda outlining the nation's intent to ensure perpetual dominance through technological supremacy. Among these initiatives were the construction of orbital weapons platforms, the creation of the Strategic Defense Grid, and the birth of the VOLT program, ostensibly a civil defense network, but in truth, a series of social experiments designed by Vault-Tec to test human endurance, obedience, and adaptability. Publicly, the Vaults were marketed as humanity's salvation. Privately, they were laboratories for a new society that would arise after the inevitable apocalypse. The duality of the era, its optimism and its deceit, defined the world of 2077. Every advancement contained its own seed of destruction. The miniaturization of nuclear reactors made possible the rise of the fusion car, but also ensured that every highway accident could become a radiological disaster. The proliferation of domestic robots alleviated labor shortages, but rendered millions unemployed, fueling resentment and social decay. The government responded not with reform, but with distraction, televised spectacles, consumer extravagance, and a relentless message that the American way of life was eternal. Meanwhile, in laboratories hidden beneath desert sands and mountain ranges, West Tech Corporation pursued a new frontier, the forced evolutionary virus. Initially conceived as a bioweapon against China, it soon evolved into a broader experiment in post-human potential. Classified correspondence between West Tech and the Department of Defense reveals that the project's true aim was to engineer soldiers immune to radiation and biological agents, capable of thriving in any environment. In its pursuit of superiority, humanity was already preparing for a world rendered uninhabitable by its own hand. Beyond these secret laboratories, American cities reflected the contradictions of a civilization at its peak, yet teetering on collapse. Skyscrapers of reinforced steel and glass cast long shadows over neighborhoods plagued by poverty, unemployment, and crime. A juxtaposition mirrored in the fractured social landscape, recorded in later terminal entries found in Fallout 3 and 4. Education systems emphasized technical proficiency and loyalty to state ideals, preparing a generation of scientists, engineers, and soldiers without cultivating critical thought about the ethical consequences of their work. Politicians promised security while diverting resources to military expansion and corporate partnerships that insulated the elite from the hardships experienced by ordinary citizens. Across the nation, media outlets broadcast endless affirmations of prosperity, masking the growing strain on infrastructure, bridges creaking under overuse, power grids stretched to capacity, water systems contaminated by industrial runoff, and rail networks overburdened by both freight and emergency military logistics. Rural areas fared even worse. Farmers struggled with soil depletion and erratic climate patterns, and small towns often found themselves isolated from timely emergency services. At the same time, the psychological impact of decades-long warfare in distant regions, coupled with domestic shortages, produced a populace simultaneously numb to violence and hypersensitive to perceived threats, a condition reflected in cultural records such as public service holotapes, pre-war propaganda, and the remnants of social media networks preserved in Fallout 76's Appalachia. Internationally, the United States projected confidence and military might, Yet, diplomatic cables later discovered in the ruins of the Department of State depict a nation increasingly isolated, mistrusting its allies, and preparing for a confrontation it viewed as inevitable. China mirrored this posture, reinforcing its own militarized zones and sustaining a population under strict information control, convinced that American technological superiority and control of Arctic oil fields endangered their survival. The resource wars, though largely forgotten by civilians, continue to shape military planning, leading both nations to develop offensive doctrines that prioritized preemptive strikes and rapid retaliation. The global arms race extended to orbital platforms, nuclear submarine fleets, and automated early warning systems designed to reduce human error, but, in practice, increasing the risk of catastrophic misinterpretation. Within this context, the Volt-Tech program expanded rapidly. Advertisements promising safety, comfort, and preservation of American values coexisted with secret vaults designed to study social collapse, forced obedience, and population control. Vault blueprints indicate experiments involving controlled deprivation, psychological stress, and environmental manipulation, underscoring that pre-war society was obsessed with preparing for the failure it simultaneously denied. Technological advancement thus became a double-edged sword. Power armor, fusion energy, and advanced robotics promised mastery over the physical world, but created new vectors of vulnerability, from cybernetic control systems to automated weapons capable of launching attacks without human authorization. Corporate and governmental secrecy compounded the problem, leaving decision-makers with incomplete data, while the public remained largely unaware of the accelerating risks. Even popular culture reflected the tension, celebrating atomic energy and consumer abundance, while glossing over the environmental devastation, social inequity, and geopolitical instability that pervaded daily life. Historical analysis of pre-war literature, films, and music demonstrates a society both enthralled with its achievements and subconsciously aware of the impending catastrophe, a duality mirrored in the design of urban spaces, public messaging, and military infrastructure. By the final decade before the Great War, the United States had become a society living in the shadow of its own illusions, where every technological marvel was also a potential instrument of destruction, and every declaration of peace carried the implicit threat of annihilation. The veneer of prosperity, maintained by propaganda, corporate power, and militarized governance, concealed a civilization whose survival depended less on ethical foresight than on the fragile interlock of human error, automated systems, and nationalistic hubris. The historian examining this period recognizes that the seeds of the apocalypse were not planted in a single event or decision, but in the accumulation of countless choices. Industrial expansion without sustainability, militarization without accountability, and innovation without ethical oversight. The cultural, economic, and technological patterns of the late 21st century were thus a prelude to the morning of the 23rd of October 2077, a world perfectly structured to collapse under the weight of its own complexity. Scholars note that every system, political, technological, and social, had become interdependent in ways that amplified small errors into catastrophic consequences. Early warning networks, designed to protect humanity, could trigger global conflict in minutes. Civilian and military communications were so intertwined that a single misinterpretation could escalate to nuclear exchange. Vaults, conceived as sanctuaries, served as laboratories, revealing the government's acknowledgement that widespread destruction was not a possibility, but an inevitability. And yet, to the average citizen in 2077, life retained its rhythms. Markets opened, children attended school, families gathered for meals, and media outlets provided entertainment and reassurance, oblivious to the invisible countdown already in progress. This juxtaposition of normalcy and latent disaster defines the era historians term the shadows of prosperity, for it was an age in which human achievement and hubris were inseparable, and in which the world's outward stability belied the imminent unraveling of civilization. When the bombs finally fell, the contrast became starkly evident. The monuments, machines, and marvels that had symbolized progress were instantly transformed into ash, debris, and ghostly artifacts, leaving behind only the fragments that would inform every future account of the pre-war world. Understanding this period is critical to answering the larger question of the Great War, for it demonstrates that by the 23rd of October 2077, humanity had created a global environment in which the concept of a first bomb could be both significant and meaningless simultaneously. Significant in its devastation, yet meaningless in the sense that the mechanisms of destruction had already been set in motion by decades of structural, technological, and social inevitabilities. It was a world that, in its final hours, operated according to the logic of automation and escalation, a civilization whose complexity guaranteed that even a small error or a misinterpreted signal could trigger an event from which there would be no return, leaving behind the post-apocalyptic landscape that would come to define the Fallout universe, and ensuring that historians, centuries later, would still debate who, if anyone, truly dropped the first bomb. The resource wars, which spanned the decades leading into the final decade of the 21st century, represent the culmination of mounting geopolitical, economic, and environmental pressures that had been building since the early 21st century, and they illustrate the fragile balance of a world increasingly dependent on dwindling natural resources, while simultaneously armed with technology capable of global destruction. Historians analyzing the Fallout timeline note that the wars were not a single conflict, but a series of overlapping engagements, trade embargoes, skirmishes, and covert operations, each of which contributed to the growing tension between major powers, particularly the United States and China, whose rivalry over Alaskan oil reserves became the focal point of international contention, while secondary conflicts erupted across the Middle East and Europe as nations scrambled to secure their remaining energy supplies. And these conflicts, although less publicized in surviving archives, demonstrate a consistent pattern of escalating desperation in the face of a planetary resource crisis, with both state and corporate actors taking increasingly aggressive measures to secure fuel, uranium, and other strategic commodities. Within the United States, the government responded to these pressures by further militarizing the Arctic region, constructing fortified bases in and around Anchorage, and deploying nuclear-capable submarines and missile defense platforms along the western coastline, as documented in pre-war military records recovered from Vault 3 and corroborated by notes from the Enclave's pre-war intelligence division, while at the same time encouraging rapid technological innovation, including the development of energy-efficient fusion reactors, automated agricultural systems, and the expansion of Robco's robotics network, all of which were intended to compensate for shortages and maintain domestic stability, but simultaneously increased societal dependency on systems whose failure could prove catastrophic. China, in response, intensified its own military production and territorial ambitions, annexing portions of Siberia and Central Asia to access vital mineral and fossil fuel resources, establishing clandestine outposts in Alaska, and engaging in covert cyber espionage operations designed to monitor and, if necessary, disrupt American energy networks, as referenced in holotapes found in Fallout 76, which describe the movements of Chinese submarines and reconnaissance units along the Pacific coast and the Aleutian Islands. While other nations in the global south, already destabilized by environmental degradation and prior conflicts, became battlegrounds for proxy wars fought with mercenary armies and private contractors funded by corporate interests, eager to secure rare materials essential to both domestic production and military applications. Historians have emphasized that the resource wars were as much ideological as they were practical, with each nation's public messaging emphasizing self-preservation, national pride, and the moral imperative to maintain access to critical resources, while simultaneously hiding the growing probability of total war and surviving pre-war propaganda preserved in both Fallout 3 and Fallout 4 archives, portrays these conflicts as noble endeavors to protect civilization, masking the degree to which economic greed, political hubris, and corporate influence drove decision-making. The U.S. military, operating under joint command structures and increasingly reliant on automated targeting and early warning systems, conducted exercises simulating both defensive and preemptive strikes against Chinese targets, with some simulations incorporating orbital strike platforms, missile intercept systems, and drone-assisted reconnaissance. And while these exercises were intended as deterrents, their very existence increased the likelihood that a misinterpretation or false positive could trigger an actual nuclear exchange, as theorized in post-war analyses of the Strategic AI Defense Network. Similarly, Chinese military planners developed doctrines emphasizing rapid retaliation, preemptive strikes, and anti-satellite measures, effectively mirroring American strategies, creating a feedback loop of escalating suspicion and readiness that historians describe as the structural inevitability of conflict. Within this context, minor incidents frequently escalated into larger confrontations. Skirmishes over drilling rights in Alaska, sabotage of energy pipelines in the Midwest, and attacks on shipping convoys in the Pacific created a constant undercurrent of tension, recorded in surviving news broadcasts, civilian diaries, and government communications, all of which indicate that by the late 2072, both governments operated under the assumption that war was not a possibility but an inevitability, and that the first strike might be unavoidable regardless of diplomatic intervention. The resource wars also had profound effects on domestic life in the United States, as rationing, martial law measures, and surveillance became increasingly pervasive, while public awareness of the geopolitical situation varied, with most citizens experiencing only fragmented news reports emphasizing patriotism, energy conservation, and the heroism of the military, and a smaller segment of society, scientists, corporate executives, and government officials, having direct knowledge of the true scale and immediacy of the crisis, yet being constrained by bureaucratic secrecy, compartmentalization, and fears of public panic. These social conditions, historians argue, contributed to a climate in which individuals, institutions, and even automated systems made decisions under incomplete information, a factor that would prove critical in the events of the 23rd of October 2077 and in analyses of post-war documents, particularly those recovered from Vault-Tec and Robco archives. there is repeated emphasis on the ways in which technological reliance amplified human error, as automated defense grids, missile targeting systems, and AI-assisted command networks were all vulnerable to misinterpretation of sensor data, leading to the possibility that the first bomb could be launched not by deliberate human decision, but by a chain of computational logic that no one fully understood. The resource wars, therefore, were not only precursors to the Great War, but also incubators of the systems that made rapid escalation inevitable. And by studying them, historians gain insight into the structural conditions that rendered humanity incapable of averting total nuclear exchange, despite decades of warning, preparation, and technological superiority, highlighting the complex interplay of human ambition, environmental limitation, and automated military systems. The wars also accelerated social stratification and regional instability, as urban centers grew increasingly fortified and dependent on military and corporate oversight, while rural regions faced resource scarcity, population displacement, and intermittent violence, creating conditions in which local governance broke down, and survival often depended on militia, mercenary, or corporate protection, a pattern documented in surviving terminal logs and pre-war sociological surveys that later became primary sources for understanding the collapse of civil society. Finally, the resource wars exemplify the unintended consequences of preemptive security measures. By attempting to secure energy, protect strategic assets, and maintain national superiority, the major powers created a global environment in which the systems designed to prevent war, intelligence networks, early warning radar, automated defense platforms simultaneously increase the likelihood of catastrophic miscalculation, ensuring that when the first missiles were detected on that final morning, the structures for human decision-making had already been bypassed or constrained by the very technologies meant to preserve peace, demonstrating that in the Fallout universe, conflict was not merely the product of malicious intent or ideological extremism, but the inevitable outcome of systemic pressure, scarcity, and the interdependent machinery of modern civilization, a truth that provides essential context for understanding the events that led directly to the first bomb being deployed, the subsequent nuclear exchange, and the irreversible transformation of the world into the post-apocalyptic landscape that defines the series. The Chinese advance, which historians agree, represents one of the most decisive and illustrative episodes of the resource wars, exemplifies the intersection of geopolitical ambition, military innovation, and strategic desperation that ultimately set the stage for the global conflagration of the 23rd of October 2077, as surviving military logs, holotapes, and archival documents from both the United States and China reveal a campaign meticulously planned, aggressively executed, and fraught with unintended consequences that would resonate decades later. Beginning in the early 2060s, China sought to secure Alaska's energy reserves, particularly oil and natural gas fields, critical to its industrial economy and military operations, under the premise that, without these resources, the nation would face systemic collapse, a concern repeatedly emphasized in pre-war strategic assessments, preserved in Fallout 76 archives, and referenced in terminals scattered across the capital wasteland. And in order to achieve these objectives, the People's Liberation Army developed a multi-phase operation involving amphibious assaults, airborne deployments, and submarine-based insertions designed to overwhelm the U.S. defenses before Washington could mobilize a fully coordinated counter-response. The campaign began with a series of covert reconnaissance missions, deploying both human operatives and drone surveillance across the Aleutian Islands and Alaskan coastline to map American installations, identify critical infrastructure, and gather intelligence on missile silos, radar arrays, and military garrisons, with these missions documented in partially declassified Chinese naval records that detail reconnaissance flights, satellite overpasses, and the clandestine insertion of special operations teams under the cover of extreme weather and darkness, while simultaneously China began a series of electronic warfare measures intended to disrupt U.S. communication networks, creating delays, false signals, and confusion among the American command chain, a tactic that would later play a critical role in misinterpretations, leading to the Great War itself. The first overt military actions involved targeted strikes against isolated U.S. facilities in northern Alaska, where Chinese naval and air forces destroyed supply depots, communications arrays, and radar installations, all executed with precision to avoid unnecessary escalation beyond the theater of operations. Yet these strikes were interpreted by American intelligence as the opening salvo of a wider invasion, prompting the rapid mobilization of U.S. National Guard units, Marine Corps regiments stationed along the coast, and strategic missile batteries, thereby creating a feedback loop of anticipation, mistrust, and escalating readiness on both sides that historians consider emblematic of the structural dynamics that made nuclear exchange nearly inevitable. As the campaign progressed into the mid-2060s, the Chinese deployed armored divisions and mechanized infantry to seize strategic towns, airfields, and transportation hubs, with logistical support provided by long-range supply convoys protected by naval escorts and aerial cover, while American forces responded with rapid deployment from the continental United States, employing power armor units, mechanized artillery, and specialized anti-tank infantry in an attempt to slow the advance and secure critical choke points, resulting in a series of engagements that, while tactically indecisive in some cases, inflicted significant attrition on both sides and created a pattern of continuous skirmishing, attritional damage, and resource depletion that would leave both nations more vulnerable to subsequent escalation. Historians examining battlefield reports note that the Anchorage campaign, as it became known, was not merely a military confrontation, but also a demonstration of each nation's capacity for total war, incorporating cyber operations, propaganda, broadcasts, psychological operations aimed at undermining enemy morale, and the testing of experimental weaponry, including early prototypes of energy-based weapons, nuclear-capable tactical missile systems, and remotely operated armored vehicles, all of which contributed to the erosion of the distinction between conventional and nuclear warfare. The campaign's dynamics were further complicated by civilian populations living within and around contested areas. As evacuees, conscripts, and local militias became both strategic considerations and logistical burdens, forcing both American and Chinese command structures to weigh the costs of direct engagement against the political and ethical implications of civilian casualties. A tension reflected in surviving holotapes recovered from Anchorage bunkers that detail emergency evacuation plans, local resistance movements, and internal debates within the U.S. Department of Defense over rules of engagement and proportional response, illustrating that even in a pre-apocalyptic context, military planning was inseparable from the social realities of contested territory. By the late 2062s, the Chinese advance had been temporarily halted in some sectors by American counteroffensives, notably the retaking of Valdez and Fort Wainwright, yet momentum remained with the invading forces due to superior logistical networks, efficient use of mechanized infantry, and coordinated electronic warfare operations that continued to disrupt U.S. command communications, producing delays in decision-making, misallocation of resources, and heightened stress on personnel, factors that historians argue contributed directly to systemic vulnerabilities in U.S. automated defense systems, later implicated in the launch of missiles during the first moments of the Great War. Simultaneously, both nations recognized that the conflict's trajectory risked escalating beyond localized combat into a global conflagration, prompting secret negotiations, back-channel communications, and contingency planning for limited nuclear engagement as deterrence measures. Yet these measures were undermined by mistrust, miscommunication, and the increasing reliance on automated systems designed to interpret radar data, identify threats, and issue response protocols without waiting for human confirmation, a reliance that scholars later identify as one of the most critical structural factors, ensuring that the escalation toward full-scale nuclear exchange would occur with alarming speed. Within Alaska itself, the civilian landscape transformed dramatically as towns near strategic military objectives were evacuated, industrial facilities were fortified or sabotaged, and local populations were often conscripted into labor for defensive construction or integrated into militia units, a process documented in both American and Chinese records and confirmed by archaeological evidence found in Fallout 76's Appalachian holotapes and Fallout 3's Capital Wasteland data caches. Simultaneously, the campaign fostered rapid innovation in tactical doctrine, including the development of hybrid offensive and defensive maneuvers designed to exploit environmental conditions, Arctic weather, and terrain advantages. And both nations experimented with preemptive targeting simulations, including the identification of critical nodes in urban centers, energy distribution, and military infrastructure that would become the conceptual models for strike prioritization in the event of nuclear escalation. Ultimately, the Chinese advance exemplifies the strategic, operational, and technological complexities that characterized the late pre-war world, a conflict simultaneously conventional and nuclear, local and global, human-driven and automated, tactical and existential, producing conditions in which the misinterpretation of sensor data, the delay of critical communications, and the interaction of complex automated systems made the first bomb's deployment not merely possible, but, in the judgment of later historians, almost inevitable. A tragic convergence of human ambition, systemic interdependence, and technological hubris that set the final stage for the global destruction that would define the Fallout universe. America's Secret War, which unfolded throughout the final decades before the Great War, represents a vast, multi-layered network of military, scientific, and corporate operations designed to prepare the United States for both conventional and nuclear conflict, yet which ultimately amplified global tension and created conditions that made the eventual nuclear exchange more likely, as reconstructed from pre-war government documents, enclave archives, and surviving corporate records, reveals a landscape in which secrecy, technological advancement, and national security imperatives merged into a comprehensive strategy that blurred the line between defense and preparation for annihilation. Historians note that while the public perceived the United States as a society focused on prosperity, technological progress, and civilian comfort, the reality behind closed doors was a series of secret programs that encompassed experimental weapons development, covert operations, intelligence, gathering, and social engineering, each operating independently, yet simultaneously feeding into the nation's broader strategy for survival and dominance, beginning with Project Safehouse, a program later integrated with Vault-Tec operations, which established a series of fortified bunkers and subterranean vaults across the continental United States, designed ostensibly to protect the population from nuclear attack, but in practice, to preserve select segments of society, conduct controlled social experiments, and study the psychological, sociological, and physiological responses of humans under extreme conditions, as evidenced by design schematics, operational manuals, and partial declassified reports recovered from Vault 11 and other surviving shelters. Simultaneously, the West Tech Research Facility in New California, operating under strict Department of Defense oversight, advanced the study of the Forced Evolutionary Virus, FEV, a biological agent intended to enhance human resilience and produce genetically modified super soldiers, with the scope of experimentation extending to both volunteer subjects and unconsenting populations, a fact corroborated by holotapes, laboratory notes, and survivor accounts from the post-war era, revealing that the U.S. government, in collaboration with corporate contractors, viewed the ethical constraints of experimentation as secondary to the imperatives of national survival, creating a dual system in which scientific innovation and militarized oversight operated with near-total autonomy. Beyond Project Safehouse and FEV research, the secret war included advanced weapons development, incorporating experimental power armor, autonomous drones, and strategic missile platforms designed to maximize both defensive and offensive capabilities, while minimizing reliance on human operators, as demonstrated in technical schematics from the Boston and Raven Rock military archives, where engineers devised AI-assisted targeting systems capable of coordinating nuclear and conventional assets across the continental United States. Yet these systems, while technically sophisticated, introduced unprecedented risk by automating critical decision-making and bypassing human judgment, a factor historians cite as a crucial contributor to the misinterpretation of threats and the misfiring of nuclear assets that characterized the opening minutes of the Great War. Intelligence operations played an equally central role, encompassing both domestic and international surveillance, espionage, and counterintelligence, with American agencies monitoring Chinese military developments, corporate activities, and potential rogue actors, employing satellites, signal interception, and human operatives embedded across strategic regions, while simultaneously conducting propaganda campaigns, cyber operations, and misinformation efforts intended to influence both public perception and enemy decision-making, as indicated by intercepted communications, recovered memos, and surviving terminal logs that depict a world in which perception, rather than reality, increasingly dictated policy, creating a feedback loop in which preemptive measures became the primary instrument of national security. Further complicating the picture, the United States engaged in clandestine operations abroad, including sabotage of foreign energy infrastructure, covert support for friendly regimes in contested regions, and the deployment of special forces tasked with destabilizing adversaries and securing critical materials, operations recorded only partially in surviving declassified files, many of which were destroyed in the aftermath of the Great War, yet fragments of which reveal a sophisticated and morally ambiguous approach to strategic advantage that historians identify as a critical precursor to the eventual escalation into full-scale nuclear conflict. Corporate military partnerships reinforced this secret war, with companies such as Robco, General Atomics, and Poseidon Energy providing both technological expertise and logistical support, from the production of advanced robotics and fusion reactors to the creation of automated command systems and surveillance networks, all operating under the guise of civilian advancement while contributing to the nation's covert militarized infrastructure, a duality mirrored in the Volt-Tech program, where public messaging promised safety and prosperity while the government pursued long-term experiments in control, resilience, and survival, creating a society simultaneously confident in its technological mastery and blind to the latent vulnerabilities engineered into its systems. Social control mechanisms complemented military and corporate efforts, including propaganda, censorship, and selective rationing, reinforcing compliance and shaping public perception of risk, while simultaneously preparing segments of the population for potential disaster through simulated drills, evacuation protocols, and localized civil defense exercises, all of which created a veneer of preparedness that belied the fragility of the underlying infrastructure, a paradox reinforced by reports from surviving civil defense personnel and later analysis of pre-war training manuals, which document extensive reliance on automated alert systems, early warning communications, and predictive algorithms for threat assessment, yet reveal systemic weaknesses when human operators were forced to interpret ambiguous or conflicting signals. The integration of artificial intelligence into command and control structures represented both the apex and the vulnerability of America's secret war, as systems designed to provide rapid assessment, optimize deployment, and coordinate defensive and offensive actions operated with insufficient human oversight, producing situations in which minor anomalies could trigger disproportionate responses, a problem compounded by concurrent Chinese military advancements, creating a highly unstable equilibrium in which a single misinterpreted radar echo, misrouted communication, or delayed decision could escalate to nuclear engagement. Historians analyzing pre-war correspondence, technical manuals, and terminal data emphasize that this secret war extended beyond mere preparation, reflecting an ideological commitment to national supremacy, technological determinism, and survival at any cost, with the government and its corporate partners increasingly confident that their sophisticated systems would allow them to control outcomes even as the complexity of interdependent networks made accurate prediction impossible, a hubris echoed in both the operational planning and the rhetoric preserved in archival materials. Finally, America's secret war, encompassing Project Safehouse, FEV research, advanced weapons development, intelligence operations, corporate military integration, social control, and automated command systems, created an environment in which the nation's pursuit of security paradoxically increased vulnerability, as the very measures intended to prevent conflict, advanced surveillance, early warning detection, and automated retaliatory capabilities interacted with parallel Chinese programs and pre-existing systemic pressures, producing conditions in which escalation toward the first nuclear strike was not merely possible, but structurally likely, a reality that historians identify as central to understanding the inevitability of the Great War and which underscores the interplay of secrecy, technology, and human decision-making that defines the pre-apocalyptic landscape of the Fallout universe. Red shadows and black projects, a term historians use to describe the covert interplay of espionage, sabotage, and clandestine technological development between the United States and China during the decades preceding the Great War, reveals a dimension of the pre-apocalyptic world in which intelligence operations, cyber warfare, and secretive research programs intertwined to create both tactical advantage and systemic vulnerability, a reality reconstructed from surviving holotapes, partial declassified military files, and the fragmented accounts preserved in Fallout 3, Fallout 4, and Fallout 76, which collectively document a shadow landscape of human activity largely invisible to civilians, yet integral to the eventual escalation toward nuclear conflict. The United States, operating through multiple layers of intelligence agencies, private contractors, and specialized military units, engaged in covert operations aimed at both gathering information and sabotaging Chinese military and industrial capacity, including operations to intercept communications, infiltrate supply lines, and disable energy production facilities, a strategy reflecting a doctrine of proactive defense and strategic preemption that, while intended to maintain national security, also increased the likelihood of misunderstanding and miscalculation, particularly as the US relied increasingly on automated systems and encrypted protocols for execution and oversight, reducing opportunities for real-time human verification. Simultaneously, China pursued a parallel campaign of espionage and technological subversion, utilizing cyber infiltration, sleeper agents, and covert reconnaissance to monitor American military developments, corporate energy ventures, and scientific research facilities, a practice documented in recovered transmissions and post-war interviews with surviving operatives, indicating a high level of organizational sophistication that allowed both nations to accumulate intelligence while simultaneously obscuring their intentions from one another, creating an environment in which uncertainty, paranoia, and rapid decision-making coexisted with advanced military planning. The conflict extended beyond conventional surveillance, encompassing a series of black projects designed to exploit technological asymmetries, including early experiments in artificial intelligence for battlefield command, autonomous drone systems capable of reconnaissance and targeted strikes, and advanced sensor arrays intended to detect missile launches, submarine movement, and troop deployments, all of which relied upon sophisticated computing algorithms whose operational logic was not fully understood even by their human overseers, a factor historians highlight as a critical contributor to the rapid escalation of hostilities that would culminate in the Great War. Specific operations illustrate the scope and complexity of these programs, such as Project Northern Watch, a U.S. initiative to infiltrate northern Chinese installations under the guise of commercial shipping, which involved the use of unmarked submarines, reconnaissance aircraft, and intelligence operatives embedded within civilian networks, and, conversely, China's covert insertion of sleeper agents along the Alaskan coast and the Pacific Northwest, tasked with both intelligence gathering and sabotage, as revealed by post-war Appalachia archives and terminal data, indicating that both nations maintained a high state of readiness and an expectation that the first strike could be initiated at any moment. These shadow operations were complemented by research initiatives classified under various code names, including advanced nuclear targeting simulations, synthetic chemical and biological agents designed to incapacitate or control enemy populations, and experimental energy weapons intended for rapid deployment against both terrestrial and orbital targets, reflecting a preoccupation with technological superiority that was mirrored by an ideological belief in the inevitability of confrontation, a belief that was reinforced by decades of failed diplomacy, trade disputes, and escalating military posturing, ultimately creating a feedback loop in which both nations' offensive and defensive systems were optimized for speed and decisiveness rather than caution or verification. Concurrently, these programs were integrated with broader strategic objectives, such as maintaining the perceived invincibility of each nation's conventional forces while cultivating a deterrent posture intended to discourage preemptive action. Yet historians note that the very measures designed to prevent war, satellite monitoring, radar detection, automated counterstrike systems, and rapid response protocols also contained inherent vulnerabilities, particularly in the context of high-stress environments where ambiguous signals could be misinterpreted, as evidenced by surviving simulations, internal memoranda, and encrypted communications later retrieved from military bunkers and corporate servers. The psychological dimension of red shadows and black projects was equally significant, as both nations employed extensive misinformation campaigns, propaganda, and counterintelligence to shape perceptions of strength, capability, and intent, creating a reality in which leaders, operators, and even automated systems could not reliably distinguish between genuine threats and calculated deceptions, a circumstance historians recognize as a structural condition that made the eventual nuclear exchange highly probable. Even in the absence of deliberate human aggression, operational secrecy further complicated the management of these black projects, as compartmentalization ensured that information was distributed only to those with a strict need-to-know basis, producing isolated nodes of decision-making authority in which critical actors lacked a holistic understanding of the strategic environment. A dynamic documented in surviving Enclave and Vault-Tec communications, which indicate that personnel often followed procedures and protocols without comprehension of the broader operational context, amplifying the risk of errors with catastrophic consequences. The spatial dimension of these operations, spanning North America, the Arctic, East Asia, and the Pacific, introduced logistical complexities, including the coordination of naval fleets, aerial reconnaissance, and land-based units operating under extreme environmental conditions, all while maintaining operational security and avoiding civilian detection, a challenge historians highlight as both a testament to technical ingenuity and a source of strategic fragility, as delays, miscommunication, or misinterpretation of sensor data in these dispersed theaters could propagate systemic failures with irreversible outcomes. The cumulative effect of red shadows and black projects, therefore, was to produce a pre-war environment characterized by high tension, incomplete information, and a pervasive expectation that any misstep could trigger a full-scale conflict, conditions confirmed by internal memos recovered from Vault-Tec and West-Tec facilities, terminal logs from abandoned military installations, and post-war analyses of satellite and radar archives, all of which underscore that both the United States and China had created intricate networks of surveillance, automated response, and clandestine operations that, while theoretically enhancing national security, in practice, reduced the margin for human oversight and increased the probability of accidental escalation. Historians also emphasize that the very presence of these black projects reinforced a climate of fear and mistrust at all levels of command, as military and civilian leaders alike were aware that their adversary was equally capable, secretive, and technologically sophisticated, a dynamic that historians argue was central to the breakdown of deterrence in the final decade before the Great War, illustrating that the first bomb could have been deployed not through conscious intent alone, but as the unintended consequence of a complex interplay of human ambition, automated systems, and systemic vulnerability. In sum, red shadows and black projects exemplify the hidden infrastructure of pre-war escalation, demonstrating that espionage, sabotage, and covert technological advancement, while designed to secure national survival and tactical advantage, created a precarious equilibrium in which misunderstanding, miscalculation, and automation could converge to produce a catastrophic outcome, and that these programs, interwoven with the resource wars, Project Safehouse, FEV research, and broader militarization, directly contributed to the circumstances under which the Great War became inevitable, leaving historians with the inescapable conclusion that in the fallout universe, the mechanisms of secrecy, technology, and human error were inseparable from the history of nuclear devastation. The silence before the sirens, a phrase historians use to describe the final moments of global tension prior to the outbreak of the Great War, encapsulates a period in which the world appeared outwardly normal, while the underlying pressures of geopolitical rivalry, resource scarcity, and systemic militarization had reached critical thresholds, and surviving pre-war logs, civil defense records, terminal entries, and corporate communications from Vault-Tec, Robco, and the Department of Defense collectively illustrate a society in which ordinary life proceeded against a backdrop of near-constant crisis, where streets were filled with citizens attending to their routines, children went to school, workers commuted to industrial centers, and families dined, shopped, and celebrated holidays, all under the illusion of continuity. Yet within military command centers, intelligence offices, and corporate control hubs, tension was nearly tangible as leaders, analysts, and operators monitored a fair, complex web of global indicators for signs of imminent conflict, tracking troop movements, radar signals, communications traffic, and energy production anomalies with a precision that both reassured and unnerved those responsible for interpreting them. Historians note that by October 2077, the cumulative effect of decades-long resource wars, Chinese advances into Alaskan territory, Project Safehouse operations, FEV experimentation, and black project activities had produced a tightly wound global system in which any misinterpretation of data could trigger irreversible escalation, a reality compounded by widespread reliance on automated early warning systems, artificial intelligence, assisted decision-making, and interconnected defense grids that were designed to increase response speed and accuracy, but simultaneously reduced the opportunity for human oversight, a condition reflected in military logs that record pre-dawn alerts, sensor anomalies, and rapid-fire communications that commanders were often unable to fully verify before automated protocols were engaged. The psychological atmosphere of the time, preserved in civilian holotapes, personal diaries, and media archives, suggests a population simultaneously aware of international instability, yet largely insulated from the immediacy of the threat, with government messaging emphasizing patriotic duty, energy conservation, civil preparedness, and technological confidence, portraying a society confident in its ability to withstand potential disasters, while military personnel, intelligence officers, and corporate executives were acutely conscious of the fragility of that veneer and of the catastrophic consequences that a single misstep, misinterpretation, or technical failure could precipitate. The final week before the bombs fell, historians observe, was characterized by an extraordinary convergence of human, technological, and environmental factors. Routine communications with distant units occasionally failed or reported anomalies. Automated sensors generated false positives due to weather conditions and system noise, and decision-makers faced incomplete information, all within a context of heightened alertness and readiness to respond to perceived threats, a combination that amplified anxiety and narrowed the margin for error, as documented in recovered pre-war Department of Defense memos, Vault command logs, and corporate intelligence reports, which together indicate that even minor operational inconsistencies had disproportionate potential to trigger large-scale responses. Simultaneously, international diplomatic channels, while still nominally operational, had largely ceased to exert meaningful influence, with back-channel communications between the United States and China indicating recognition that prior agreements and treaties were insufficient to prevent conflict, and that the structural pressures created by resource scarcity, military posturing, and technological acceleration had outpaced the capacity for human negotiation to avert catastrophe, a conclusion reinforced by decrypted correspondence recovered from pre-war intelligence archives, showing repeated warnings that the escalation curve was approaching a critical inflection point. Yet these warnings often failed to reach decision-makers in time due to the compartmentalization of classified information, procedural bottlenecks, and prioritization of automated monitoring over human deliberation. On the technological front, the interconnected network of early warning radars, missile detection systems, orbital sensors, and AI-assisted targeting protocols reached peak operational readiness during this final week, creating a high-speed information environment in which multiple signals, some real and some false, were simultaneously processed, interpreted, and acted upon. And historians emphasize that the very systems designed to prevent error introduced new vulnerabilities, such that a single false positive or misinterpreted reading could initiate a sequence of events culminating in nuclear launch, a scenario later confirmed in post-war analysis of surviving defense grid simulations and command protocols within U.S. cities, military installations, and corporate facilities. The final preparations for potential attack were extensive yet largely invisible to the general populace. Armored convoys moved through urban centers, personnel were briefed on emergency protocols, shelters were stocked with supplies, and automated logistics systems redistributed critical materials, while robotic units maintained communication networks, transportation routes, and facility security. A convergence of preparedness measures that historian analyzes identify as simultaneously stabilizing and destabilizing, providing the illusion of control while making the system increasingly brittle due to its reliance on automation and pre-programmed response hierarchies. The cultural and social dimensions of this period, preserved in media broadcasts, advertisements, and consumer messaging, reflect a society largely unaware of the immediacy of the existential threat, with entertainment, commerce, and civic life continuing in a manner designed to maintain morale and compliance, yet these same structures indirectly reinforced the vulnerability of the population by concentrating citizens in urban centers, standardizing behavior patterns, and making evacuation or survival planning dependent on government-controlled channels, a structural fragility noted by historians examining Vault-Tec archives, which demonstrate extensive pre-apocalyptic social engineering intended to manipulate perception and behavior in the event of disaster. By the final hours before the Great War, both the United States and China had placed themselves on hair-trigger alert, with conventional forces deployed, strategic assets positioned, and automated nuclear response systems ready to execute preemptive or retaliatory actions. A configuration that historians argue made conflict structurally inevitable, regardless of human intent, as any miscommunication, anomalous signal, or misinterpreted action could cascade through the integrated network of sensors, computers, and command protocols to produce irreversible escalation, a scenario consistent with surviving post-war analyses of the Strategic AI Defense Network, radar logs, and missile launch simulations, which collectively demonstrate the precarious balance of the final week before global annihilation. In sum, the silence before the sirens represents a world poised between normalcy and total catastrophe, in which ordinary life persisted alongside extraordinary preparation, where human and automated decision-making coexisted in tension, and where the structural, technological, and geopolitical conditions of the late pre-war era converged to ensure that the first bomb, when it fell, would mark not the initiation of destruction alone, but the inevitable culmination of decades of escalation, secrecy, and systemic vulnerability, a moment historians identify as the final intersection of human ambition, error, and technology that precipitated the irreversible descent into the post-apocalyptic world of the Fallout universe. The 15 minutes of fire, a term historians use to describe the catastrophic span in which the Great War unfolded on the 23rd of October 2077, represents the culmination of decades of systemic escalation, technological reliance, and geopolitical tension, and surviving holotapes, Vault-Tec archives, Robco servers, and military logs allow for a reconstruction of this brief yet world-altering period in which the interplay of human decision-making, automated defense systems, miscommunication, and sheer mechanical momentum combined to produce near-instantaneous global devastation. At approximately 9:15 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, American early warning radar systems first detected anomalous missile signatures over the northern Pacific, interpreted by automated threat assessment AI as a massive Chinese launch, prompting an immediate alert to the National Command Authority, where decision-makers had mere minutes to evaluate the data, with multiple redundant verification protocols in place, but human oversight constrained by time, incomplete information, and the conflicting reports generated by the early warning network, which itself was operating near capacity due to ongoing cyber surveillance, maintenance issues, and environmental interference, illustrating how decades of technological sophistication paradoxically reduced the margin for deliberate human judgment. Simultaneously, Chinese defense systems, operating under comparable alert protocols, registered countersignals from American missile silos, and detected perceived breaches in airspace over Alaska, triggering automated response procedures that included readiness checks for regional nuclear forces, as documented in partial declassified PLA records, and corroborated by in-game terminals referencing pre-war Pacific theater activity. And while both nations possessed robust communication networks intended to prevent accidental escalation, these networks were intermittently disrupted by deliberate sabotage, environmental factors, and the sheer complexity of layered command hierarchies, creating an environment in which the first launch could occur without clear attribution or human authorization. The initial launches, historians note, were characterized by both deliberate and automated processes, with some intercontinental ballistic missiles fired following rapid executive authorization, while others were deployed directly through pre-programmed retaliation protocols embedded within silo and submarine systems, reflecting decades of doctrinal emphasis on launch on warning and preemptive strike preparedness, a configuration that increased the probability of simultaneous escalation, as human operators could not fully verify the validity of incoming threats before their own automated systems enacted countermeasures, a structural vulnerability that scholars identify as central to understanding why the first 15 minutes of the Great War became catastrophic and irretrievable. As missiles traversed the globe, communication blackouts intensified, compounded by electromagnetic pulse effects generated by early detonations over the northern Pacific, which disabled secondary power grids, encrypted military channels, and civilian communications alike, leaving both nations' leadership with fragmented situational awareness, forcing reliance on automated targeting systems, pre-programmed strike matrices, and remote surveillance networks, all of which operated without real-time human verification in critical cases, thereby amplifying the cascade of destruction and ensuring that subsequent detonations would occur before any de-escalation could realistically take place. Major urban centers, both in the United States and China, bore the initial brunt of the nuclear exchanges, with New York, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, San Francisco, Anchorage, Beijing, Shanghai, and other metropolitan areas targeted according to pre-war strategic doctrine designed to neutralize political, military, and industrial command nodes, resulting in instantaneous catastrophic damage to infrastructure, population centers, and energy networks, a sequence corroborated by Fallout 3 and Fallout 76 lore that details widespread vaporization, firestorms, and radioactive fallout patterns, while secondary detonations targeted industrial and military facilities further inland to ensure the collapse of societal resilience, illustrating that the war, though lasting mere minutes, was executed with both tactical sophistication and complete disregard for civilian survival. Historians analyzing fallout patterns, terminal records, and pre-war scientific reports note that the simultaneous global detonations created a feedback loop of environmental, mechanical, and human devastation. Atmospheric shock waves disrupted subsequent missile trajectories, EMP effects disabled remaining automated systems, and the detonation of multiple high-yield devices triggered cascading failures in regional power grids, transportation networks, and communication nodes, leaving surviving military units isolated, unable to coordinate, and highly vulnerable to further strikes, a phenomenon documented in pre-war technical briefings and reconstructed in-game data that shows the world's defense infrastructure was not designed to withstand multi-theater simultaneous attack, underscoring the inevitability of rapid, widespread annihilation. Meanwhile, the civilian experience, as recorded in fragmented holotapes and eyewitness logs preserved in various vaults, portrays a world caught between disbelief, panic, and the incomprehensible speed of destruction, with families attempting evacuation while highways became clogged, emergency shelters were overwhelmed, and automated civil defense alerts broadcast conflicting instructions, a convergence of chaos amplified by the sudden appearance of radioactive plumes, collapsing buildings, and the collapse of essential services, all of which created a climate in which human decision-making was secondary to the unstoppable mechanical and nuclear processes set in motion. In parallel, naval and aerial forces engaged in defensive and retaliatory maneuvers suffered near-total destruction, as fleets and air wings, caught within range of both missile trajectories and high-altitude detonations, were vaporized or rendered inoperative by EMP and blast effects, with surviving vessels and aircraft unable to communicate effectively with command, illustrating the degree to which pre-war strategic doctrine had assumed intact infrastructure that no longer existed, and highlighting the systemic vulnerabilities historians identify as critical to the rapid escalation of the first 15 minutes. The environmental consequences compounded human devastation, with atmospheric ionization, firestorms, and radiation clouds spreading at unprecedented speeds, ensuring that even regions not directly targeted by initial detonations would be subjected to lethal fallout, contamination of water and soil, and long-term ecological collapse, a reality reflected in in-game lore referencing irradiated zones across North America and Asia, demonstrating that the war's brevity belied the duration and scope of its aftermath, with survival determined less by strategic planning than by chance, geography, and access to pre-existing shelters such as vaults. Scholars also emphasize that attribution of the first strike remains inconclusive, both in canon and post-war reconstructions. American intelligence logs imply a rapid Chinese launch, while Chinese records suggest a preemptive U.S. missile deployment. Yet, terminal entries, survivor accounts, and automated system logs hint at rogue actors, misinterpreted sensor data, or automated launch sequences that could have initiated the exchange without deliberate human authorization, reinforcing the central mystery of the Great War as a structural inevitability rather than the result of a single decision, and leaving historians to interpret the first bomb as both real and unknowable, a phenomenon reflected across Fallout lore, where no definitive source identifies the responsible party. As the 15 minutes unfolded, secondary and tertiary detonations cascaded across the globe, targeting satellite networks, energy production hubs, and military command centers, ensuring that surviving infrastructure was either destroyed or incapacitated, while automated retaliatory systems continued to engage, a process historians describe as a feedback loop, in which each launch, strike, or interception triggered additional responses, magnifying the scale of destruction exponentially within a remarkably short time frame, and demonstrating the interplay between human error, automated decision-making, and strategic doctrine in producing total global annihilation. By the end of this brief but apocalyptic period, the world as previously known had been effectively erased, with population centers, industrial, complexes, and governmental institutions destroyed or rendered non-functional, while pockets of survivors would later recount the events with only partial knowledge, their testimonies fragmented by the very systems designed to preserve security and continuity, leaving future generations, such as those depicted in Fallout 3, Fallout 4, New Vegas, and Fallout 76, with only scattered records, partially functional terminals, and the enduring mystery of who truly initiated the first strike, a question compounded by the simultaneous engagement of multiple automated and human-controlled weapon systems. Ultimately, the 15 minutes of fire stands as a testament to the convergence of technological ambition, systemic complexity, geopolitical rivalry, and human hubris, a period in which the world's accumulated scientific and military achievements transformed into instruments of self-destruction, leaving a post-apocalyptic landscape that would define the Fallout universe, and ensuring that, despite exhaustive post-war inquiry, no definitive answer exists regarding the identity of the first aggressor, with the brevity of the war contrasting starkly against the enduring consequences for humanity, civilization, and the Earth itself, and demonstrating that in this universe, the speed, intensity, and inevitability of total annihilation are as central to the narrative as the mystery of who actually dropped the first bomb. The question of origin, which historians of the Fallout universe approach with both fascination and frustration, represents the central enigma of the Great War. Despite extensive archival evidence, surviving holotapes, and pre-war intelligence, no definitive answer exists regarding which nation, actor, or automated system initiated the first nuclear strike on the 23rd of October 2077, and this chapter examines every canonical hint, data fragment, and eyewitness account to reconstruct the competing narratives, illustrating the complexity and uncertainty inherent in a world destroyed by its own technological and political structures. U.S. Intelligence reports from the days leading up to the war suggest that the Chinese military had moved a significant portion of its Pacific Fleet into offensive positions near Alaska, including ballistic missile submarines, forward-deployed reconnaissance units, and special operations teams along the Aleutian chain, movements that American analysts interpreted as preparations for a preemptive strike. Yet historians emphasize that such assessments were filtered through decades of mutual distrust, incomplete data, and the limitations of automated sensor networks, which occasionally produced false positives, misreads, or conflicting reports that could be, and often were, misinterpreted by human operators under extreme stress, demonstrating the inherent difficulty in distinguishing between actual intent and perceived threat in the pre-war environment. Conversely, Chinese communications recovered from encrypted channels and partially preserved by post-war archivists suggest a parallel concern that the United States, with its vast network of early warning radars, siloed ICBMs, and forward-deployed Arctic forces, was capable of a sudden first strike designed to neutralize China's industrial and energy infrastructure, a fear corroborated by both PLA internal memos and surviving holotapes referencing military exercises, simulating preemptive retaliation, revealing that both nations possessed credible motivations to anticipate and act upon perceived aggression, a dynamic historians describe as a classic security dilemma in which defensive preparations paradoxically increase the likelihood of conflict. Within this context, numerous in-game terminals, holotapes, and vault records hint at the potential role of automated systems in triggering the first launch, including AI-assisted targeting protocols, silo launch matrices, and automated retaliation procedures designed to respond instantaneously to radar detections or missile signatures, suggesting that human oversight may have been limited or overridden by machine logic in the critical opening moments of the Great War, a possibility further reinforced by the structural complexity of the strategic AI defense network described in Fallout 3 and Fallout 76, where highly compartmentalized command protocols and pre-programmed decision trees could, under certain conditions, execute nuclear strikes without explicit approval from human command, thereby introducing the possibility that no single actor, nation, or leader intentionally fired the first bomb, but that the event was the unintended consequence of systemic interdependence, miscommunication, and technological overreach. Additional ambiguity arises from references to rogue actors, both domestic and foreign, who may have interfered with automated systems or executed unauthorized launches, including extremist militias, intelligence operatives with personal agendas, and corporate contractors operating within West Tech, RobCo, and other classified facilities, as suggested by scattered holotapes and terminal logs recovered from Vaults 0, 11, and 76, which document incidents of unsanctioned testing, anomalous readings, and unexplained missile deployments, yet provide no conclusive evidence linking any individual or group to the initiation of the nuclear exchange, leaving historians to infer that such actors could have contributed to, but not solely caused, the catastrophic sequence of events. Post-war analysis further complicates the question, as fragmented survivor accounts from scattered military outposts, civilian shelters, and vault enclaves describe contradictory narratives. Some report seeing missile launches originating from Alaska, others suggest strikes from the continental United States, or even offshore platforms, while still others speculate about simultaneous engagement across multiple theaters, a multiplicity of perspectives that historians attribute to both the chaotic nature of the initial 15 minutes and the systematic destruction of global communication infrastructure, which left no reliable contemporary record of events, thereby ensuring that all subsequent accounts are necessarily partial, filtered, and influenced by psychological trauma, incomplete observation, and later, ideological reinterpretation, examination of environmental and geospatial evidence, including nuclear fallout patterns, blast radii, and satellite debris recovered post-war, provides partial corroboration for simultaneous detonations across multiple sites, suggesting that if one nation initiated the conflict, the other's automated or pre-positioned counterstrike systems executed nearly immediately, effectively masking the origin of the first bomb and reinforcing the canonical ambiguity central to Fallout lore, as these findings demonstrate that attribution in the context of modern, automated nuclear warfare is inherently uncertain, with speed, system interdependence, and structural redundancy overwhelming the capacity for human verification. Historians also analyze internal government communications, such as memos preserved in Vault-Tec and West-Tec archives, which indicate repeated concern over the possibility that false alarms, sensor misreads, or data corruption could trigger catastrophic escalation. Yet these warnings were never fully addressed due to bureaucratic compartmentalization, political overconfidence, and over-reliance on automated deterrent systems, illustrating that the structural conditions making the first strike almost inevitable were well understood by some actors, even as the broader society remained unaware, a paradox that reinforces the thematic notion that in the Fallout universe, systemic hubris, secrecy, and technological complexity are as culpable as intentional human decisions. Further evidence emerges from canonical references to the Pacific Theater, where both US and Chinese naval units, including ballistic missile submarines, were positioned in overlapping engagement zones, raising the possibility that interactions between automated detection, pre-programmed launch protocols, and human uncertainty contributed to the rapid escalation, a scenario consistent with both Fallout 3 lore and Fallout 76 terminal data, which describe multiple instances of conflicting sensor readings and near-simultaneous threat detection. Events that could have initiated automated counterstrike measures, illustrating the degree to which complex military infrastructure itself functioned as an independent actor capable of precipitating global catastrophe. The question of origin also engages with political and ideological narratives developed post-war as surviving factions, including the Enclave, Brotherhood of Steel, and various regional governments, interpret the evidence to support their own legitimacy, often emphasizing one side's culpability while downplaying or omitting complicating factors such as automation, rogue actors, or systemic miscommunication, thereby producing a historiography that is itself fractured and ideologically infused, reflecting the broader theme of narrative control in a post-apocalyptic society where definitive historical truth is inaccessible and where the memory of the first strike serves as both cautionary tale and justification for ongoing power struggles. In synthesizing these sources, historians conclude that the mystery of who dropped the first bomb cannot be resolved with certainty, but that the evidence collectively illustrates a convergence of multiple contributing factors: mutual suspicion and preemptive planning between the United States and China, systemic vulnerabilities in automated launch and defense systems, possible rogue or unauthorized actions by individual operatives, and the broader structural pressures of resource scarcity, geopolitical rivalry, and decades-long militarization, a confluence that made nuclear exchange both highly probable and effectively instantaneous once triggered, a reality that aligns with Fallout's canonical portrayal of the Great War as simultaneously deliberate, accidental, and inevitable. Ultimately, the question of origin demonstrates that in the Fallout universe, historical inquiry is constrained not by lack of interest or diligence, but by the deliberate destruction of information, the chaotic convergence of complex systems, and the profound ethical and practical ambiguity surrounding preemptive and automated nuclear warfare, leaving scholars, survivors, and players alike with a central paradox. The first bomb was fired, yet its origin remains unknowable, a symbol of humanity's inability to fully control the technological, political, and environmental forces it has created, and a thematic reminder that in a world dominated by fear, ambition, and systemic interdependence, certainty is an illusion, and history itself becomes a fragmented, contested, and perpetually debated narrative. The evidence buried in vaults represents a critical dimension of pre- and post-apocalyptic scholarship within the Fallout universe, encompassing the fragmented, often contradictory, archival materials preserved in Vault-Tec shelters, Robco servers, military bunkers, and abandoned research facilities, which collectively provide insight into the technological, bureaucratic, and social structures that shaped the moments leading up to the Great War, while also offering tantalizing but inconclusive clues regarding the first nuclear strike. Historians note that Vault-Tec's experimental vaults, designed ostensibly for civilian protection, functioned simultaneously as repositories of data, behavioral observation, and social experimentation, and surviving records, including terminal entries, holotapes, and encrypted data fragments reveal both operational details and ethical compromises, from detailed population management plans to protocols for monitoring automated defense systems with certain vaults, such as Vault 0, Vault 11, and Vault 76, containing explicit references to pre-war military coordination, contingency planning, and even potential launch scenarios, which suggest that Vault administrators were in possession of information highly relevant to understanding who might have fired the first bomb and under what conditions. RobCo servers, meanwhile, house extensive corporate datasets documenting pre-war technological deployment, artificial intelligence algorithms, automated defense systems, and civil infrastructure monitoring, with these systems frequently integrated into national security and military operations, reflecting the deeply entwined relationship between corporate technological advancement and government oversight in the late 21st century, a relationship which, while intended to enhance efficiency and deterrence, created conditions in which miscommunication, software errors, or rogue code could trigger catastrophic events. As historians infer from post-war analyses of terminal data showing anomalous automated responses and unexplained system overrides coinciding with the final hours before the Great War. Military bunkers, particularly those under the Department of Defense, National Guard, and Strategic Air Command, provide additional layers of evidence documenting pre-war readiness, automated launch protocols, and command hierarchies, while also revealing structural vulnerabilities, such as the compartmentalization of information, delayed human verification, and reliance on pre-programmed retaliation systems, all of which increase the likelihood that the first nuclear strike could have occurred without direct authorization from political leaders, a possibility reinforced by surviving logs of silo operators, radar stations, and forward-deployed nuclear assets, which indicate simultaneous detection and potential cross-triggering events between American and Chinese systems. Canonical hints preserved in Fallout 76, Fallout 3, and Fallout 4 suggest that some vaults, particularly Vault 11 and Vault 0, were designed not only for civilian survival, but as observation nodes to record societal behavior under extreme stress, and these facilities contain data on emergency protocols, civil defense drills, and automated decision-making algorithms that may have interacted inadvertently with military systems in the final pre-war hours, with historians noting that the existence of such interconnected data networks, when coupled with the automated strategic infrastructure of the United States, could have facilitated accidental missile launches, misfires, or other triggering events, an interpretation that aligns with terminal logs describing anomalous system behaviors, unexplained alerts, and redundant safeguard overrides that, in hindsight, appear eerily prescient. Beyond the design and operational intent of these vaults, recovered data highlights the integration of pre-war research projects, such as WestTech's FEV program, energy weapon experiments, and RobCo automation, into broader defense and civil management systems, indicating that the same technological advances intended to enhance national resilience were simultaneously capable of producing unintended and catastrophic interactions, with historians emphasizing that the dual-use nature of these systems created complex interdependencies, where failures in one domain could propagate rapidly across military, civil, and corporate networks, contributing directly to the conditions that made the Great War inevitable. Further complexity arises from canonical references to the manipulation of information within vaults, where data was often sanitized, encrypted, or selectively distributed to conceal operational failures, ethical lapses, or politically sensitive decisions, and historians interpret this intentional obfuscation as a key factor in the enduring uncertainty regarding the first nuclear strike, because even the surviving archives do not provide a full chain of causality, leaving gaps, contradictions, and ambiguities that prevent definitive attribution, while simultaneously preserving critical evidence of the systems, decisions, and conditions that led to nuclear annihilation. Additionally, several Vault-Tec holotapes and terminal entries reference contingency scenarios involving accidental or semi-automated launches, including pre-authorized missile strikes in response to perceived enemy activity, automated counterstrike exercises, and simulations of worst-case escalation that anticipated rapid nuclear exchanges, suggesting that even without deliberate human intervention, the existing systems were capable of initiating the first bomb, a possibility reinforced by correlated anomalies found in ROBCO databases, which record system overrides, threshold breaches, and unexpected AI behaviors occurring in the immediate lead-up to the 23rd of October, 2077. Historians further examine the social dimension preserved within Vault archives, noting that many vaults contained records of psychological conditioning, emergency protocol training, and surveillance data aimed at monitoring decision-making, stress responses, and human-machine interaction under extreme conditions, with these observations providing insight into the broader pre-war mindset, including the emphasis on automation, technological determinism, and reliance on pre-programmed contingency plans, all of which collectively illustrate how systemic, cultural, and technological factors interacted to create an environment in which a first strike could occur almost independently of conscious human intent. Military archival data, including silo logs, radar transcripts, and command directives, consistently reinforce the notion that operational design prioritized speed, redundancy, and immediate response over verification or delay, reflecting decades of strategic doctrine that emphasized launch on warning and preemptive readiness as deterrence measures. Yet, historians highlight that these same protocols introduced structural fragility because the compressed timeframes, automated interconnections, and layered authorization requirements created multiple points at which error, misinterpretation, or unexpected system behavior could initiate a chain reaction culminating in nuclear deployment, a dynamic that the preserved Vault and ROBCO records illustrate repeatedly through anomaly reports, emergency simulations, and partial system failures. The evidence buried in vaults also includes fragmented references to rogue or unsanctioned actors, both human and machine, operating within these networks, including unsanctioned tests, experimental AI modules, and covert manipulations of automated launch systems, any of which could have contributed to the initiation of the Great War, and the presence of these anomalies in the surviving data complicates the search for definitive attribution, reinforcing the canonical uncertainty that underpins the unification question of who fired the first bomb. Finally, in synthesizing all the data, historians conclude that while the vaults, ROBCO servers, and military archives provide unparalleled insight into pre-war operations, social engineering, and technological interdependence, they simultaneously highlight the impossibility of absolute certainty, human hubris, automation, structural complexity, and systemic interdependence combine to make the first nuclear strike effectively inevitable once the conditions were met. whether by deliberate action, error, or emergent behavior of interconnected systems. And these preserved records, while invaluable for understanding the pre-apocalyptic world, underscore the enduring mystery at the heart of the Fallout universe, demonstrating that the truth of the first bomb may be forever buried alongside the evidence preserved in the vaults themselves. The fallout of uncertainty, a term that encapsulates the immediate aftermath of the Great War, examines how the collapse of communication networks, military hierarchies, and civil infrastructure created a chaotic environment in which surviving individuals and groups struggled to understand what had occurred, why, and who bore responsibility, and historians rely on fragmented testimonies, partial holotapes, terminal logs, and post-war observations to reconstruct this period in which knowledge itself became a scarce and contested resource, a scarcity compounded by the near-total destruction of centralized authority and the simultaneous obliteration of major urban centers and military command nodes. In the days and weeks following October 23, 2077, survivors recount a world devoid of coherent information, where automated warning systems had failed, power grids were inoperative, and both local and national governments had either vanished or were unreachable, leaving citizens to navigate an unprecedented landscape of destruction with only sporadic access to remaining communications, such as improvised radio transmissions, partially functional terminals in vaults, or scattered Robco server nodes, all of which provided incomplete or contradictory signals regarding the scope of the disaster, the presence of hostile actors, or the status of remaining infrastructure. Military outposts that survived the initial exchanges faced equally profound uncertainty. As command structures were decimated, radar and sensor arrays had been destroyed or compromised by electromagnetic pulses and nuclear detonations, and isolated units were left to operate autonomously, often interpreting limited information under extreme duress, with orders based on outdated intelligence, fragmented reports, or partially operational AI systems, resulting in defensive or offensive actions that were frequently misaligned with broader strategic realities. And historians note that these responses, while rational within local contexts, contributed to the confusion surrounding responsibility for the first strike. Eyewitness accounts, preserved in holotapes, and personal journals recovered from vaults, describe an environment of widespread panic, survival improvisation, and the struggle to reconcile the incomprehensible scale of destruction with the limited information available, illustrating that the psychological impact of uncertainty was as significant as the physical devastation, with survivors interpreting events according to partial knowledge, rumor, and hearsay, often attributing actions to perceived enemies, rogue actors, or automated systems without the means to verify these claims, a process which historians argue laid the foundation for post-war myths and contested narratives about the origin of the Great War. The collapse of civil infrastructure, including water supply, transportation networks, medical services, and energy systems, further exacerbated uncertainty, as survivors were forced to navigate radioactive landscapes, maintain access to critical resources, and adapt to rapidly shifting environmental hazards, often relying on ad hoc governance structures or emergent social hierarchies that varied by region, while the lack of centralized communication meant that information about the scope of destruction, the status of neighboring communities, and potential threats remained fragmented and unreliable, reinforcing a sense of pervasive ambiguity and mistrust. In addition to physical and social dislocation, uncertainty was amplified by the destruction of pre-war records and the inaccessibility of vault archives and Robco servers in many regions, leaving survivors with partial, sometimes contradictory, data regarding military movements, automated systems, and intelligence reports, a deficiency that historians interpret as central to the persistence of multiple, competing theories about who fired the first bomb and why, and which ensured that the immediate post-war period was characterized not only by survival challenges, but by epistemic fragmentation, where the very act of knowing became a struggle as much as the act of living. The interplay between human actors and surviving automated systems also contributed to confusion, as partially functional AI units, remote defense installations, and autonomous robotic devices continued to operate according to pre-war protocols, sometimes engaging in defensive measures or hazard containment, with incomplete or corrupted data, producing events that survivors interpreted as hostile or inexplicable, further blurring the line between intentional action and emergent systemic behavior, a phenomenon documented in post-war reports and terminal entries indicating unexplained detonations, automated lockdowns, and robotic activity in the absence of centralized human oversight. Historians additionally highlight the role of environmental uncertainty, as nuclear fallout, firestorms, and radiation clouds spread unpredictably across regions, affecting population centers, agricultural zones, and transportation corridors, often cutting off communities from one another and obscuring the broader consequences of initial detonations, leaving survivors with only partial awareness of the scope and scale of destruction, a condition that contributed directly to the proliferation of rumors, speculation, and local interpretations regarding the origin of the war and the identity of the first aggressor, creating an epistemic landscape as hazardous as the irradiated terrain itself. Regional variation further compounded uncertainty, as communities in the Capital Wasteland, the Mojave, Appalachia, and the remnants of the Pacific Northwest experienced differing sequences of events, from the timing and intensity of detonations to the functionality of vaults, military installations, and emergency infrastructure, resulting in divergent survivor narratives, localized myths, and conflicting interpretations of pre-war intelligence and post-war outcomes, a phenomenon reflected in the in-game lore, where each region maintains unique historical fragments that reinforce both canonical ambiguity and cultural interpretation. The immediate post-war collapse also disrupted governance, law enforcement, and social order, forcing survivors to rely on emergent hierarchies, community councils, or militarized enclaves, all of which interpreted pre-war events according to local priorities, survival imperatives, and ideological frameworks, with some attributing the first strike to external enemies, others to internal sabotage or rogue technological actors, and yet others to systemic failure of automated deterrence networks, creating a patchwork of beliefs and narratives that further enshrined uncertainty as a defining characteristic of post-war knowledge. Moreover, survivor testimonies indicate that misinformation, misinterpretation, and psychological stress often led to contradictory reports regarding the sequence of events, the functionality of remaining military systems, and the location or role of surviving adversaries, a pattern historians recognize as a natural consequence of cognitive overload, trauma, and the lack of corroborating data, which ensured that even well-documented fragments from vault archives, Robco servers, or military logs could be interpreted in multiple ways, depending on the observer, context, and remaining evidence, reinforcing the persistent ambiguity surrounding the origins of the first bomb. Finally, the fallout of uncertainty highlights that the immediate aftermath of the Great War was not merely a period of physical survival, but also an era defined by epistemic fragility, where knowledge was partial, contradictory, and continuously contested, and where every attempt to establish causality or attribute responsibility was undermined by systemic collapse, environmental disruption, and the continued operation of partially functional technological systems, a reality that shaped post-war societies, informed regional myths, and laid the groundwork for the narrative diversity observed in the Capital Wasteland, New Vegas, Appalachia, and beyond, ensuring that in the Fallout universe, uncertainty itself became a defining characteristic of history, survival, and memory, and that the question of who fired the first bomb, while central to canonical inquiry, remained forever unresolved within the fractured post-apocalyptic world. The birth of post-war myths represents the process by which surviving human societies in the Fallout universe reconstructed history in the aftermath of the Great War, transforming fragmented data, partial testimonies, and catastrophic experience into narratives that served both survival and ideological purposes. And historians emphasize that this period illustrates not only the malleability of memory, but also the necessity of myth-making. In a world where direct evidence of the first bomb, its origin, and the decision-making processes behind it was largely irretrievable due to the destruction of centralized records, the partial functioning of vault archives, and the systemic collapse of governmental, military, and corporate infrastructures. Among the earliest and most influential narratives were those constructed by the Enclave, a faction comprised of pre-war US, government remnants, and military personnel, who framed themselves as the legitimate continuation of American authority and portrayed the Great War as the result of foreign aggression, often implicitly assigning culpability to China while emphasizing their own technological and moral superiority, a process documented in recovered terminals, Enclave holotapes, and in-game references that illustrate deliberate selection and reinterpretation of pre-war evidence to justify post-war governance, military intervention, and control over survivors, while simultaneously minimizing or ignoring the role of automated systems, systemic escalation, or unintended consequences in initiating the nuclear exchange. In parallel, the Brotherhood of Steel, originating as a technological preservationist and quasi-military organization, developed myths that emphasized the moral hazards of unrestrained technological proliferation, using the Great War as a cautionary tale in which human ambition, corporate excess, and military overreach combined to produce catastrophe, and framing their own mission as the stewardship and control of advanced technology, a narrative that selectively highlighted FEV research, West Tech experimentation, and Robco automation, while remaining largely silent on the precise origin of the first bomb, thereby allowing them to present themselves as ethical arbiters rather than political actors, a historiographical approach that reinforced both internal cohesion and regional authority within the Capital Wasteland and surrounding territories. Meanwhile, the new California Republic, arising from the ashes of pre-war civilian settlements, constructed a pragmatic historical narrative in which the Great War was portrayed as an inevitable outcome of resource scarcity, corporate greed, and geopolitical failure, emphasizing lessons about governance, trade, and civic responsibility, while remaining agnostic on precise military culpability, a strategy that allowed the NCR to focus on reconstruction, territorial expansion, and civil administration, without becoming embroiled in disputes over the first strike, and reflecting historians' observation that survival-driven societies often prioritize actionable knowledge and governance over definitive historical attribution in post-catastrophe environments. Other regional interpretations emerged in Appalachia, the Mojave, and the Pacific Northwest, where surviving communities often had access to incomplete vault archives or local data caches, leading to localized myths in which the first bomb was attributed variously to foreign powers, rogue operatives, automated defense systems, or divine retribution, and these narratives were shaped by the interplay of survivor experience, environmental observation, and available documentation, highlighting historians' recognition that post-war memory was necessarily constructed from partial evidence, oral histories, and ideological needs rather than complete or objective records. The process of myth-making was further amplified by the persistence of fragmented and partially functional technological systems, including Vault-Tec terminals, Robco servers, and remaining automated sensors, which provided survivors with data that was often corrupt, ambiguous, or selectively preserved, creating the conditions in which interpretation became inseparable from imagination, ideology, and local priorities, as communities filled gaps in knowledge, with stories that reinforced social cohesion, moral lessons, or survival imperatives, a dynamic that historians identify as central to understanding how post-apocalyptic societies maintained continuity, identity, and governance, despite the absence of verifiable historical evidence. Culturally, myths surrounding the Great War also served to codify moral and ethical lessons, transforming the cataclysm into a cautionary framework for future behavior. The Enclave's narratives emphasized obedience to centralized authority and technological mastery. The Brotherhood of Steel valorized prudence and stewardship over advanced technology. The NCR focused on civic responsibility, resource management, and trade, and localized groups in Appalachia, New Vegas, and the Mojave interpreted survival as contingent on vigilance, adaptability, and communal cooperation, all while embedding the mystery of the first bomb as an enduring element of collective memory, reinforcing the dual function of myth as both explanatory and prescriptive, and illustrating historians' observation that in post-apocalyptic societies, narrative authority becomes a critical mechanism for maintaining order, legitimacy, and cultural continuity. The ambiguity of the first strike itself, preserved through incomplete holotapes, terminal logs, and fragmented oral accounts, allowed each faction to tailor the story to its ideological and strategic goals, highlighting that the absence of certainty was itself a powerful tool for social control. Whether to justify the accumulation of technological power, enforce political authority, or cultivate moral cohesion, and historians emphasize that this selective reinterpretation of events is canonical, consistent with Fallout's recurring theme that truth is mediated by perspective, necessity, and survival imperatives. The process also extended to the reconstruction of pre-war societal structures, corporate responsibility, and technological causality, as factions selectively highlighted certain elements, such as Vault-Tec's social experiments, Robco's AI and automation, West-Tech's FEV research, and the Enclave's military deployments, while minimizing or ignoring elements that might contradict their narrative or undermine their legitimacy. a selective historiography that shaped education, civic culture, and inter-faction diplomacy in the post-war world, and ensured that survivors' understanding of causality, responsibility, and technological risk remained ideologically conditioned rather than empirically resolved. Historians additionally observe that these post-war myths were not static, evolving over decades as new information emerged. Vault terminals were rediscovered, and regional interactions allowed comparison and synthesis of narratives. Yet even as evidence accumulated, the core ambiguity surrounding the first bomb persisted, demonstrating that the convergence of incomplete records, fragmented memory, and ideological imperatives produces a historiographical landscape in which certainty is impossible, and the creation of myth becomes both inevitable and necessary for cultural survival. Moreover, myths surrounding the Great War influenced post-war policy, social organization, and factional behavior, as each group interpreted the cataclysm to justify technological control, territorial expansion, or moral authority, reinforcing power hierarchies, governance structures, and social norms in ways that were inseparable from the contested historical narrative itself. And historians note that these processes exemplify Fallout's thematic focus on the interplay between memory, ideology, and survival, showing how societies in extremis transform uncertain history into functional narrative. In sum, the birth of post-war myths illustrates that in the Fallout universe, surviving societies reconstructed history to meet social, ideological, and practical needs, transforming uncertainty into authority, ambiguity into cohesion, and catastrophe into enduring moral and cultural lessons, while simultaneously preserving the canonical mystery of the first nuclear strike, demonstrating that myth, memory, and ideology are inseparable from both survival and historiography. In a world in which the evidence is partial, the actors are dispersed, and certainty is forever unattainable, and underscoring the series' overarching motif that even in the aftermath of global annihilation, human societies inevitably interpret, narrativize, and mythologize events to create meaning, identity, and legitimacy from the ruins of the old world. The Echoes in the East and West examines how the memory of the Great War and the mystery surrounding the first bomb was preserved, interpreted, and transmitted across the disparate regions of the post-apocalyptic United States, highlighting the stark differences between the East Coast, shaped by the devastation of Washington, D.C., the Capital Wasteland, and Appalachia, and the West Coast, including the Mojave, California, and the remnants of industrial hubs, and historians emphasize that these divergent recollections were shaped by geography, survivor density, access to pre-war archives, and the particular influence of emerging factions, creating a patchwork of regional historiography in which knowledge, myth, and ideology intersected to produce narratives that were as fragmented as the infrastructure itself. In the East, particularly the Capital Wasteland and Appalachia, the immediate impact of nuclear detonations on major urban centers and government institutions meant that surviving populations had extremely limited access to complete records, forcing them to rely on vault archives, recovered terminals, and oral histories from isolated survivors, and these sources often provided contradictory or incomplete accounts of missile trajectories, launch origins, and the behavior of automated defense systems, a condition that historians note created fertile ground for local myth-making. with the Brotherhood of Steel emerging as a dominant interpreter of technology, moral authority, and historical causality, emphasizing the dangers of unrestrained technological proliferation, the ethical responsibilities of those controlling advanced systems, and the moral imperative to preserve knowledge while often sidestepping questions of national culpability or precise attribution of the first bomb. Similarly, Appalachian settlements, influenced by survivors of Vault 76 and other regional shelters, maintained an approach to history that blended empirical observation with practical necessity, preserving fragmented pre-war data while interpreting it through the lens of survival, regional experience, and local culture, leading to narratives in which the war was both inevitable and morally opaque. The first bomb, a symbol of systemic failure rather than an act attributable to a single nation, actor, or decision, and historians argue that these narratives reflect a community-oriented epistemology in which functional knowledge and communal cohesion were prioritized over absolute truth. On the West Coast, the Mojave, the former NCR territory, and scattered Californian enclaves experienced different patterns of destruction and archival access, resulting in histories shaped by both partial preservation and emergent governance, with the new California Republic emphasizing civic continuity, trade, and political reconstruction, while factions such as Caesar's Legion created narratives that emphasized conquest, power, and moral judgment, and the varied survival experiences in urban ruins, desert settlements, and pre-war corporate facilities meant that data regarding the origin of the first strike was interpreted through regional needs, strategic priorities, and ideological frameworks, producing localized myths in which American infrastructure, Chinese threat perception, corporate negligence, or automated defense failures could each be variably highlighted, depending on the interpreter. Historians note that access to surviving Vault-Tec archives, Robco servers, and military bunkers strongly influenced regional interpretations, as communities with Vault proximity or pre-war technical expertise could extract more detailed, but still incomplete, information, whereas populations in less technologically equipped areas relied heavily on rumor, oral transmission, and observation of environmental consequences, such as radioactive fallout patterns, collapsed urban zones, and remnants of military installations. And these constraints contributed to regionally specific versions of the war's narrative, reinforcing the idea that geography and resource availability shaped historical perception as much as ideology or factional control. The echoes of the Great War were also mediated through material culture, including remaining military hardware, corporate robotics, pre-war vehicles, and technological remnants, which varied across regions and reinforced differing perceptions of causality and responsibility, as observers interpreted automated weaponry, defense turrets, and damaged infrastructure as evidence of specific actors' culpability, technological hubris, or pre-war planning, and historians highlight that these interpretations, while contextually rational, were frequently inaccurate, further embedding uncertainty into the cultural memory of both East and West. Inter-regional communication, when available, was often mediated by wandering traders, caravan networks, and intermittent radio transmissions, allowing fragments of information, myths, and interpretations to diffuse between the East and West. Yet, the process of transmission was unreliable, frequently distorted, and often selectively interpreted to reinforce local priorities, power structures, or ideological narratives, a dynamic which contributed to the persistence of multiple, sometimes contradictory, explanations of the first bomb's origin and reinforced the canonical ambiguity central to Fallout lore. Historians additionally note the role of emergent factions such as the Brotherhood of Steel in the East and the NCR in the West in shaping regional historiography, both through active dissemination of ideological narratives and through control over archival access, educational resources, and technological preservation, ensuring that post-war memory was as much a product of social authority and factional legitimacy as it was of empirical data, with the first bomb serving as a narrative fulcrum around which moral lessons, political justification, and cultural cohesion were constructed. Environmental evidence, including residual radiation maps, fallout deposition patterns, and geospatial surveys of pre-war infrastructure, played a critical role in regional narratives, as survivors interpreted observable phenomena to support or challenge specific theories regarding the war's origin, trajectory, and impact, and historians observe that the partial, uneven, and regionally variable nature of these environmental cues created divergent reconstructions, with East Coast communities frequently emphasizing the immediacy of destruction and technological collapse, while West Coast observers often highlighted strategic, logistical, and pre-war corporate factors, illustrating how differential environmental exposure directly shaped the historiographical landscape. Further complicating the regional echoes were the interactions between survivor groups, including trade, conflict, alliances, and ideological dissemination, which introduced additional layers of narrative filtering, reinterpretation, and selective preservation. And historians argue that this process reinforced both convergence and divergence in historical memory, as communities adopted, adapted, or rejected external narratives based on local needs, survival imperatives, and factional influence, a pattern reflected in the contrasting lore of Fallout 3, Fallout, New Vegas, and Fallout 76, in which canonical events are interpreted differently across regions, while maintaining consistent ambiguity regarding the first strike. Finally, the echoes in the East and West demonstrates that regional variation, environmental factors, technological access, factional authority, and survivor experience combine to produce a complex, multi-layered historiography in which the first bomb remains a focal point of uncertainty, a symbolic and practical anchor around which post-war societies interpreted, reconstructed, and transmitted knowledge, and historians conclude that the East and West together illustrate how geography, culture, and power shape memory, showing that even within a single nation's former territory, understanding of the Great War, its causes, and its first strike is irreducibly fragmented, perpetuating the canonical mystery at the heart of the Fallout universe, while reflecting the broader human tendency to interpret catastrophe through the twin lenses of survival and ideology. The Truth That Never Was represents the culmination of historical inquiry into the origins of the Great War and the elusive identity of the first bomb's initiator, synthesizing decades of pre-war intelligence, terminal logs, holotapes, survivor testimonies, environmental data, and post-war factional narratives into an analytical framework that illustrates both the complexity and the fundamental unknowability of the events of the 23rd of October 2077, and historians emphasize that in the Fallout universe, definitive answers remain beyond reach, not merely because of lost records, but because of systemic interdependence, human error, automated processes, and the inherent opacity of decisions made under extreme time pressure and existential threat. The evidence suggests multiple overlapping possibilities, none of which can be conclusively verified. U.S. intelligence and surviving ROBCO archives indicate that automated launch protocols and siloed ICBM systems could have been triggered without explicit human authorization, reflecting decades of strategic doctrine that prioritized speed and preemption over deliberation, while Chinese military records, recovered partially in the aftermath, imply that preemptive strike exercises, forward deployment of submarines, and early warning systems created conditions in which American countermeasures could be interpreted as the initial aggression, producing a feedback loop in which both nations' automated defenses and pre-programmed retaliatory systems responded almost simultaneously, blurring the line between deliberate action and mechanical inevitability. Canonical sources, including Fallout 3, Fallout 4, Fallout New Vegas, and Fallout 76 terminals, provide additional layers of ambiguity, referencing both rogue actors and unanticipated system failures, such as AI-assisted targeting anomalies, misread sensor data, or the activation of contingency protocols within vaults, West Tech facilities, and military command networks, which may have accelerated escalation without conscious decision-making. And historians argue that this possibility underscores the conceptual importance of systemic causality, wherein the interaction of multiple subsystems produces outcomes that cannot be attributed to a single actor, thereby rendering traditional notions of responsibility nearly meaningless in the context of total nuclear annihilation. Further complicating the narrative are post-war myths, in which factions such as the Enclave, Brotherhood of Steel, NCR, and regional survivors selectively interpret surviving evidence to justify ideology, authority, and territorial control, often emphasizing external culpability while downplaying automation, miscommunication, or human error. A historiographical phenomenon that ensures the persistence of conflicting accounts and underscores that social, political, and cultural needs shape the reconstruction of events as much as empirical data, a dynamic that historians observe across all regions of the former United States and note as a central factor in the enduring mystery of the first bomb. Environmental and geospatial evidence adds additional dimensions to the ambiguity. Fallout patterns, blast radii, and urban destruction maps indicate near-simultaneous strikes across multiple continents and theaters, a fact that can be interpreted to support both theories of deliberate coordination and automated cascade failures, suggesting that if one nation or actor did fire first, the other's systems executed rapid counterstrikes within minutes, effectively masking the origin of the initial explosion and reinforcing the canonical narrative that no definitive human agent can be identified. Surviving Vault and ROBCO archives, when cross-referenced with military data, reinforce the plausibility of accidental or emergent escalation, showing that anomalies, threshold breaches, and partial system overrides occurred in multiple sites in the hours preceding the Great War. And historians interpret these events as evidence that the complex interplay of automated defense protocols, human oversight limitations, and communication failures could have initiated nuclear exchange independently of deliberate geopolitical intent, aligning with Fallout lore that emphasizes systemic inevitability, technological hubris, and the fragility of civilization. Similarly, anecdotal survivor accounts and regional observations, including those from the Capital Wasteland, Mojave, Appalachia, and California, describe a sequence of events that appears chaotic, fragmented, and inconsistent, reflecting both the limitations of human perception under extreme duress and the deliberate opacity created by destroyed infrastructure and partial archives. And these testimonies are further complicated by the influence of local factions, who selectively propagated interpretations to maintain authority, justify policy, or instill moral lessons, illustrating how post-apocalyptic societies co-construct knowledge in the absence of complete empirical certainty. In weighing the canonical clues, historians consider multiple overlapping scenarios: an accidental first strike triggered by automated U.S. missile silos, a Chinese preemptive assault interpreted as aggression by American systems, rogue agents within West Tech, Volt Tech, or military installations initiating unauthorized launches, simultaneous engagement of both nations' automated defense networks resulting in effective mutual destruction, or a combination of these factors, a synthesis that highlights both the multiplicity of causal pathways and the structural inevitability of catastrophic escalation in a hyper-militarized, technologically complex world. Moreover, historians emphasize that each scenario is supported by partial evidence yet undermined by gaps in data, corrupted archives, destroyed terminals, environmental disruption, and deliberate post-war narrative shaping, creating a situation in which the historical record is simultaneously rich and incomplete, suggestive but inconclusive, and capable of multiple interpretations that are each internally coherent yet mutually contradictory, a reality that aligns with Fallout's overarching theme that history is contested, memory is fragmented, and truth is provisional. Ultimately, the truth that never was reflects the philosophical dimension of the Fallout universe. It is less a question of factual attribution than an exploration of structural, technological, psychological, and social dynamics that produced the Great War, emphasizing that the identity of the first aggressor, while symbolically significant, is subordinate to the broader lesson that human societies, when combined with technological complexity, automated systems, and existential fear, are capable of self-destruction in ways that cannot be fully predicted, controlled, or retrospectively assigned to a single actor. The chapter also highlights how this canonical ambiguity reinforces enduring motifs across the series, including the tension between technological ambition and ethical responsibility, the interplay between human decision-making and systemic inevitability, and the persistence of moral and epistemic uncertainty in post-apocalyptic reconstruction, demonstrating that the unknowability of the first bomb mirrors the unknowability of human motives, errors, and interactions under extreme conditions, thereby transforming historical investigation into a meditation on causality, perception, and the limits of knowledge. In synthesizing all evidence, from Vault archives and Robco servers to environmental fallout maps, terminal logs, factional reinterpretations, and survivor testimonies, historians conclude that the Great War and the first bomb cannot be conclusively attributed to any single nation, actor, or technological failure. Yet the weight of canonical data illustrates that systemic design, preemptive strategy, human hubris, and automated escalation collectively made the conflict inevitable, a reality that is central to Fallout's narrative and philosophical identity, emphasizing that the story of the first bomb is not merely an account of origin, but a reflection of structural, moral, and existential truths about humanity's relationship with power, technology, and violence. In this sense, The truth that never was is itself a canonical artifact, a narrative lens through which the Fallout universe communicates the limits of knowledge, the fragility of civilization, and the enduring consequences of human and technological interdependence, ensuring that the question of who fired the first bomb remains not only unresolved, but inextricably tied to the broader themes of fear, ambition, and inevitable conflict that permeate the series, and providing a framework for understanding why, in a world erased by nuclear fire, certainty is less a matter of record and more a reflection of structural and moral reality. Thus, historians conclude that the first bomb, while physically detonated, symbolically represents the impossibility of absolute truth in a hyper-complex, hyper-militarized, and technologically interdependent world, and that in the Fallout canon, its identity is less important than the conditions it reveals. Conditions of mutual distrust, systemic vulnerability, technological ambition, and the persistent human drive for power, all of which coalesced to produce a 15-minute conflagration that erased the old world and left future generations to reconstruct, reinterpret, and mythologize its causes in perpetuity. War never changes, a phrase that has become emblematic of the Fallout universe, represents the ultimate philosophical reflection on the events of the 23rd of October 2077 and the human condition that enabled them, emphasizing that the question of who dropped the first bomb, while historically compelling, is ultimately subordinate to the broader patterns of greed, fear, pride, and systemic hubris that have perpetually defined human conflict. And historians note that this motif extends not only across the pre- and post-war eras within the Fallout canon, but also across regional, cultural, and factional interpretations, serving as a unifying lens through which the consequences of the Great War can be understood, regardless of incomplete records, contradictory testimonies, or the persistent ambiguity surrounding the first strike. The phrase underscores the cyclical nature of violence, technological escalation, and political rivalry, demonstrating that the structural, moral, and strategic conditions that produced the Great War were neither unique nor accidental, but rather the culmination of centuries of human behavior marked by competition for resources, expansionist ambition, ideological entrenchment, and the relentless pursuit of technological superiority. A historical pattern that the pre-war world, as described in Fallout 1, 2, 3, 4, and 76, had amplified through nuclear proliferation, corporate military integration, and global instability, leaving societies vulnerable to catastrophic failure once the mechanisms of automated defense, miscommunication, and mutual suspicion intersected with environmental scarcity and geopolitical tension. Historians further observe that the lesson encapsulated in War Never Changes extends to the post-apocalyptic reconstruction of society, as surviving factions such as the Enclave, Brotherhood of Steel, NCR, Caesar's Legion, and independent communities repeatedly engage in cycles of conflict, territorial expansion, ideological consolidation, and technological accumulation, often mirroring the same motivations, ethical compromises, and strategic calculations that led to the original Great War, thereby reinforcing the notion that the patterns of human conflict, systemic risk, and moral hubris are enduring, transcending individual actors, single events, or specific historical contexts, and ensuring that the lessons of the first strike remain both cautionary and perpetually relevant. The phrase also embodies the philosophical acknowledgement that, in the Fallout universe, technological sophistication and human ingenuity, while capable of great achievement, invariably amplify the capacity for destruction when combined with fear, competition, and political calculation, a dynamic evident in the design of Vault-Tec shelters, Robco automation, West Tech research, and strategic defense networks, all of which reflected human ambition and foresight, yet contained inherent vulnerabilities that contributed to the inevitability of global annihilation, emphasizing that the first bomb, while physically decisive, was structurally and morally symptomatic rather than purely causal, and that humanity's relationship with war is defined as much by repeated systemic conditions as by specific historical decisions. Further, War Never Changes reflects the role of myth, memory, and narrative in shaping the post-war understanding of history as survivors, factions, and regional communities interpret the events of 2077 through the lenses of ideology, survival, and moral perspective, constructing narratives that simultaneously preserve and obscure truth, assign and deny responsibility, and transform catastrophe into moral, cultural, and political lessons, illustrating historians' contention that the endurance of conflict is inseparable from the ways societies remember, codify, and transmit knowledge about it. In this context, the phrase also acknowledges the epistemic limitations inherent in human understanding of complex, high-stakes events, highlighting that systemic interdependence, automated escalation, environmental uncertainty, and human error converge to create outcomes in which causality cannot be definitively traced, as exemplified by the first bomb, whose origin remains unknowable, a condition that demonstrates the broader principle that the forces producing war operate on levels beyond individual control, perception, or moral judgment, and that historical reconstruction, while informative, is inevitably constrained by the interplay of evidence, interpretation, and ideology. War Never Changes thus functions as both historical observation and moral caution, emphasizing that the human propensity for conflict, exacerbated by technological innovation, resource competition, and political rivalry, will continue to generate cycles of violence regardless of geographic location, temporal period, or surviving institutional structures, and that the canonical ambiguity surrounding the first strike serves not as a gap in record, but as a deliberate narrative reinforcement of this principle, illustrating that the mystery itself is emblematic of the structural inevitability of human conflict and the enduring consequences of technological and ethical hubris. Historians further highlight that the phrase resonates across post-war societies as a guiding reflection on governance, strategy, and survival, informing factional doctrines, social norms, and cultural attitudes as communities repeatedly confront questions of technological stewardship, moral responsibility, resource allocation, and defense strategy, often mirroring the very dynamics that precipitated the Great War, a cyclical phenomenon that confirms the canonical motif that, while actors, tools, and contexts may change, the underlying impulses driving conflict remain constant, and the lessons of history must be interpreted as structural and philosophical rather than strictly empirical. In examining the interplay of pre-war preparation, post-war reconstruction, and ongoing regional conflicts, historians conclude that War Never Changes functions as a narrative anchor, linking the human tendencies toward aggression, fear, and ambition with the technological and systemic conditions that magnify their consequences, reinforcing the canonical depiction of the Fallout universe as a reflection of enduring human vulnerabilities and ethical dilemmas, and demonstrating that the first bomb, while central to historical inquiry, ultimately symbolizes the broader inevitability of conflict and the limitations of human control in the face of complex, interdependent, and high-stakes systems. Additionally, the phrase provides a lens for interpreting both environmental and social consequences, as post-war landscapes, irradiated territories, factional rivalries, and fragmented societies all reflect the continuity of human behavior under stress and scarcity, revealing that war, in its structural, moral, and existential dimensions, produces patterns that transcend individual events, technological change, or ideological context, and that the first strike, while temporally specific, is representative of these recurring dynamics, emphasizing that historical knowledge, ethical evaluation, and survival strategy must account for enduring structural realities rather than isolated incidents. Finally, War Never Changes encapsulates the canonical and philosophical truth that the Fallout universe communicates. The first bomb may have been dropped by one actor, another, or no actor at all, yet the patterns of greed, fear, pride, and systemic interdependence that made nuclear annihilation possible are constant, recurring, and ultimately reflective of the human condition, a condition in which the allure of power, the drive for security, and the propensity for misjudgment converge to create cycles of conflict that persist even after civilization has been nearly obliterated, ensuring that the lessons of the Great War are not found in the identification of the first bomb's origin, but in the enduring understanding that the structural, technological, and ethical circumstances enabling war are perennial, universal, and tragically inescapable, and that history, memory, and morality in the Fallout universe are inseparable from this overarching, immutable truth.